Stop the bus! Please, stop! He's not supposed to be out here!" The scream cut through the freezing dark, and Denise Carter slammed both feet on the brake so hard the whole bus shuddered and groaned to a halt, 3 feet from the old man standing frozen in her headlights. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there in the middle of that empty 4-lane road at midnight, a thin gray man in a thin gray coat, blinking into the light like he'd wandered out of another lifetime entirely and couldn't find his way back in. A young woman in hospital scrubs came running up behind him, breath steaming, her badge swinging on a lanyard, and she wrapped her arm around the old man's shoulders, the way you'd guide a child away from the edge of something.
"I'm so sorry,"
she gasped up at the windshield. He gets out. He's always trying to get somewhere. And the old man, still staring straight through the glass at Denise, straight through her, like she wasn't even there, said the only words he seemed to have left in the whole wide world. "I have to get to the house with the blue door," he said. "My girl is waiting." Now, Denise Carter had been driving the last night bus through this cold city for 6 years, and she had seen just about everything a person can see through a windshield after midnight. But she had never seen anything that would change her life the way that old man was about to. Because 3 weeks from that frozen night, she would find out exactly whose girl was waiting behind that blue door, and the answer would crack her own past wide open and hand her back something she had given up for lost, a long, long time ago. So pull your chair a little closer and let an old storyteller take you all the way back to the beginning. Because this is a story about the kindness we give to strangers and the strange, holy way that kindness has of finding its way back home. Denise Carter was 38 years old, and she drove the Route 9 Nightline. It was the very last bus of the night, the one that ran the long loop from the hospital district out past the shuttered factories and the all-night diners and the bus barn on the edge of town, and then turned around and did it all again until 2 in the morning. It was not a route anybody wanted. The day drivers had families to get home to and bright kitchens to sit in. The Nightline belonged to the people the city forgot after dark. The dishwashers coming off the late shift, the security guards, the nurses' aides with aching feet, the lonely souls who rode the loop just to be somewhere warm and moving instead of somewhere cold and still. Denise knew most of them by face, if not by name. She kept the heat running a little higher than the rules allowed. She kept a box of granola bars in the fare console for anybody who looked like they hadn't eaten, and on the coldest nights, she pretended not to notice when somebody fell asleep and rode the loop twice, because she understood better than most that sometimes a warm bus is the closest thing a person has to a home. She understood it because Denise Carter had spent a good part of her own life with no home to speak of. She had grown up in the system, foster homes, group homes, the back seats of caseworkers' cars, 11 different addresses before she was 18. She had learned, very early and very young, the thing that nobody should have to learn that young. Belonging is not a thing the world hands you. It is a thing you have to build with your own 2 hands, board by board, and even then, a storm can take it. There had been exactly one place, one time, that had ever felt like the real thing. But we'll come to that. Every story has a door it's saving for the end. Now Denise had a home of her own. A small one, 2 rooms over a laundromat, the dryers thumping through the floor till midnight, the rent a little higher every year. But it was hers, and in it slept the whole of her heart, her son Malik, 9 years old. All elbows and questions and a gap where his front tooth used to be. Malik, who left his shoes in the middle of the floor for her to trip over. Malik, who saved the blue gummy worms for her, because he knew they were her favorite. Malik, who was the entire reason Denise dragged herself onto that cold bus 6 nights a week and drove the loop until 2 in the morning, so that he could have the one thing she never did. A door that was his. A door that nobody could ever make him leave. Her neighbor across the hall, an old widow named Mrs. Okafor, sat with Malik on the nights Denise drove, and the 2 of them watched cooking shows and argued cheerfully about whether the contestants had used enough salt. It was a fragile arrangement, held together with goodwill and casseroles. It was the only arrangement Denise had. And lately, that arrangement, and everything else, felt like it was hanging by a thread. Because the Transit Authority had announced budget cuts, and the very first line on the chopping block was the late loop, the Route 9 night line. Low ridership, not cost-effective. Denise had read the memo 3 times in the break room and felt the floor tilt under her, because she knew exactly what it meant. If the night line went, she went with it. And a single mother with a high school diploma and no savings does not bounce back from losing the one job that pays the rent. So she had every reason in the world, that freezing Tuesday night, to keep her eyes on the road, follow the route exactly as written, and not get involved with one more lost soul who would only complicate a life that was already complicated enough. She had every reason to drive on. But you already know she didn't drive on. You saw her stop the bus. That first night, after the young aide in scrubs had walked the old man back toward the long, low brick building behind them, Denise sat at that empty intersection for a long moment, with her hands shaking on the wheel and her heart going like a drum. The place was called Maple Court Senior Living, a memory care facility. Denise had seen the sign when her headlights swung across it. "My girl is waiting." That's what he'd said, and something about the way he'd said it had reached into Denise's chest and squeezed. She thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was the beginning. Because 2 nights later, near the end of her last loop, the old man climbed onto her bus. He came up the steps slow and careful, one hand on the rail, the cold coming off his coat in a wave. He had no fare. He had no bag. He had a worn brown coat buttoned all the way to his chin, a gray beard, and dark eyes that were gentle and frightened and somewhere very far away. He stood at the front of the bus and looked at her. Then he said, with the exhausting politeness of a man who had been raised to never be a bother to anybody, "Does this bus go to the house with the blue door?" Denise looked at him. She should have called it in. The rules were clear. An unaccompanied, confused, vulnerable rider. No fare. Clearly not all right. Procedure said radio dispatch, hold the bus, wait for someone to come. Procedure, in other words, said make him somebody else's problem. Instead, Denise said, "Why don't you have a seat up front here, sir, where it's warm, and we'll figure it out together." He sat down in the seat right behind her, folded his hands in his lap, and looked out the dark window like a man watching for a face in a crowd. And as she pulled the bus back onto the loop, Denise did the one thing she should not have done. She talked to him. "What's your name?" she asked, watching him in the big mirror. He thought about it. You could see him reaching for it, the way you reach for a word that's right there on the tip of your tongue. "Walter," he said finally, and the relief on his face when he caught it was something to see. "Walter. My mother named me Walter." "Well, Walter, I'm Denise, and the blue door. Can you tell me where it is?" And here is where Denise first understood what she was dealing with. Because Walter's face went still, and then it crumpled, soft and confused, like a child's. He started. "It's down past there's a maple tree out front. I planted it myself. My girl, she used to swing on the branch." His hands moved in his lap, restless. "I painted that door blue with my own 2 hands. So she'd always know it was home, so she could find her way back to it." He looked up at Denise, and his eyes were wet. "But I can't. I can't seem to find the street anymore. The streets keep moving. The streets keep moving." Denise drove the rest of that loop in silence, the old man watching the dark for a blue door that his own mind had taken away from him. And something in her, something she'd buried under 6 years of night shifts and budget memos and bone-deep tiredness, quietly broke open. She knew that feeling, the feeling of a home you can't get back to. She had spent her whole childhood riding toward a door that kept moving. At the end of the loop, the aide from Maple Court was waiting at the curb. She came aboard apologizing all over again and gently took Walter's arm. But before she let him off, Walter turned in his seat and looked at Denise one more time. "You'll let me know," he said, "if you find the blue door." And Denise Carter, who knew better, who had a job to protect and a son to raise and not 1 ounce of spare anything in her whole life, heard herself say, "I'll let you know, Walter, I promise." It became a thing after that. A quiet thing that lived in the cracks of Denise's nights. 3-4 times a week, Walter would find his way out of Maple Court. and that in itself worried Denise. How easily he got out. How nobody seemed able to keep that man behind a locked door. He would climb onto her bus, and she would let him ride the last loop in the warm seat behind her. Then she would call the aide, a kind, overworked young woman named Priya, to come collect him at the end. And every night, Walter looked for the blue door. And every night, the streets kept moving. Denise started learning the shape of him. She learned that on the good nights, Walter could tell her things. About working wood, about the smell of fresh-cut pine, about the union hall where he'd spent 30 years as a carpenter, building other people's houses, beautiful houses, houses with grand staircases and bay windows, while he himself lived in rented rooms. She learned that he had been a proud man once, a maker of things, a man whose hands could turn a plain board into something that would outlast him. And she learned that whatever else the years had stolen from Walter Boyd, and they had stolen nearly all of it, they had not been able to steal two things. They could not take the blue door, and they could not take the name. Carol, he would say sometimes, soft, almost to himself, his thumb rubbing a slow circle on the back of his own hand. My Carol. Who's Carol, Walter? My girl. And his whole face would light up, and then cloud over, the joy and the grief arriving together, the way they always did with him. My girl. I have to get back to her. I told her I'd come back. One night, a slow night, the bus near empty, snow coming down soft and orange under the streetlights. Walter reached into the deep inside pocket of his brown coat, the one he never let anyone touch, and he brought out something small wrapped in a handkerchief. He unwrapped it on his knee with the care of a man handling something holy. It was a little wooden house, no bigger than his palm, carved by hand from a single block of pine, sanded smooth as soap. Every tiny window and shingle worked in with a patience that took Denise's breath. And the front door of that little house, the size of a fingernail, had been painted careful and bright, a clear robin's egg blue. I made two, Walter said. One for her, one for me. So we'd both have the home, see, even when we were apart, so she'd know. He turned it over in his trembling fingers, and his voice dropped to almost nothing. I always meant to go back. A man tells himself he'll go back when things are better, when he's done something he's not ashamed of, when he's got something to give her. He looked up, and the tears were running freely down into his gray beard now. And then you look up, and 40 years are gone, and you can't even find the street. There was one night, a good night, his mind clearer than usual, when Walter told her about May. He didn't use the name. He never could hold on to the name, but he told Denise about a girl he'd married when he was 22, and broke and full of plans. A girl who used to sing while she hung the wash. A girl who believed in him when the bank didn't. A girl who'd stood in the empty front room of a half-finished little house and told him it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, even with the floors still bare and the windows still papered over. I built that house for her, Walter said, his voice gone soft and far away. With these hands. Every board. I wanted to give her something that would last. He looked down at those hands, turning them over in the bus light, old and spotted and shaking now. And then she didn't last. And I had a baby girl, and no wife, and no idea in this world how to be a father by myself. His jaw worked. I told myself I'd come back for my girl once I was a whole man again, once the grief let go of me, once I had something to give her besides a house full of her mama's ghost. He fell quiet. Some men never do get to be whole again, Denise. They just get old. Denise drove on through the snow and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because her own throat had closed. She knew that arithmetic, too. She had watched it work on 100 grown-ups in 100 foster homes. The good intentions. The I'll get my act together and come back for you. The years that ate those promises one by one. She had been on the receiving end of more than one, and she thought, not for the first time, that the saddest people in the whole world are not the cruel ones. The saddest people are the ones who loved somebody truly and were simply too broken, too poor, too crushed by the weight of their own lives to make it back across the distance in time. Denise had to pull the bus over. She told the dispatcher it was ice on the windshield. It was not ice on the windshield. She sat there in the dark with the snow coming down and an old stranger weeping quietly behind her over a little wooden house with a blue door, and she made a decision that she knew, even as she made it, might cost her the only job she had. She was going to find Carol. It was not easy. I will not pretend to you that it was easy, the way these things are sometimes made to look easy. Denise had almost nothing to go on. A first name, Carol. A last name she got from Priya at Maple Court, who looked it up off his intake file when no supervisor was watching. Boyd, Walter Boyd, age 78. A trade, carpentry. A union local that had merged into another local 20 years back. And a blue door under a maple tree, somewhere in a city that had torn down half its old neighborhoods and renamed the other half. She worked it in the cracks of her life. On her break in the bus barn, hunched over her cracked phone. At the public library on her one day off, at a free computer, with Malik doing his homework at the table beside her, asking every 5 minutes if they could go yet. She called the Carpenters Union and got a man named Sal who remembered Walter Boyd. Sure, Walt, good hands, quiet fella, kept to himself. But he had no current address, no family contact, nothing but a memory and a long pause and a sorry he couldn't be more help. She hit walls. So many walls. There were nights she came home at 2 in the morning and sat at her own kitchen table and thought, Denise, what are you doing? You can barely keep your own roof. You can't go saving a man who doesn't even remember your name from one night to the next. Let it go. But then she would think about her own self at 12 years old, in the back of a county car, watching one more house go by that wasn't going to be home. And she could not let it go. Here is the thing that finally cracked it open. It was Malik. Denise had told her son the story. About the old man on her bus. About the little carved house. About the blue door he couldn't find. And Malik, who was 9 and therefore believed that every problem in the world has a solution, if you just look at it right, said, Mama, why don't you just find the maple tree? He said he planted it himself. Old trees are easy to find. They're huge. Out of the mouths of babes, a carpenter, a man who built things to last, would have planted a real tree, a good one, in a yard he owned, in the one short stretch of years when he'd had a yard to own, before whatever happened and he had to leave. Denise stopped chasing the man and started chasing the house. Property records, old deeds, a man named Walter Boyd, sometime around 40 years ago. It took 3 trips to the county office, and a clerk who took pity on her, but on the 3rd trip, the clerk slid a printout across the counter, and there it was. A small property, on the east side, purchased by a Walter and a May Boyd, sold off again, barely 4 years later. May. Walter had never once said the name May, and Denise, looking at that record, understood why. May Boyd, deceased, the record said, the year before the house was sold. The whole sad shape of it came clear to her, right there at the county counter. A young carpenter, a wife named May, a baby girl named Carol, a little house with a maple tree and a blue door, bought with a young man's whole hope. And then May was gone, taken by an illness, the way too many were taken in those years, and a grieving young father, poor, alone, with a small daughter, and no idea on God's earth how to raise her by himself, did the thing that broke him. He gave her to May's people to raise. Just for a while, he told himself. Just until he got back on his feet. Just until he had something to offer her but his grief and his empty hands. And then 40 years went by, the way they do. The address was right there on the page. Denise wrote it down with a hand that wasn't quite steady. And then she did something she almost never let herself do. She let herself hope. The house was on the far east side, on a street that had come up in the world while Walter was busy losing his place in it. The factories that had once filled that part of town were gone, and the little working houses had been bought up and fixed up. The maple trees that some long-gone fathers had planted on those lots had grown tall and wide and golden. Denise drove out there on her day off, with Malik in the passenger seat because she couldn't get a sitter, and truthfully, because she didn't want to do this alone. She parked across the street and looked. There was the maple. Huge now, exactly like Malik had said, its bare branches spread over the whole front yard. And there, beneath it, was a small, neat house, freshly painted, well-loved. And the front door was blue. A different blue than the little carving, softer, newer, but blue. Someone, at some point, had painted that door blue and kept it blue, year after year, repaint after repaint, the way you keep a thing because it matters and you're not entirely sure why. Denise sat in her car for a full 5 minutes and could not make herself get out. Malik finally undid his own seatbelt and said, "Mama, we came all this way." And that was that. She walked up the path under the maple with her son's hand in hers and her heart in her throat. Then she knocked on the blue door. It opened, and the woman standing there was somewhere in her 60s, warm-faced, gray coming into her hair, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a dish towel over her shoulder. She looked at Denise, and Denise looked at her. And the whole world fell out from under Denise Carter's feet. Because she knew that face. She had not seen it in 20 years, but she would have known it in 20,000. It was older now, softer, lined. But it was the same face that had looked down at a hard, frightened 12-year-old girl in a county car a long time ago and said the only words that had ever made that girl feel like a human being instead of a case file. "Well, come on in out of the cold, baby. You're home now." "Miss Carol?" Denise whispered. The woman's reading glasses slipped down off her forehead. Her mouth opened. Her eyes searched Denise's face, traveling backward through 2 decades, and Denise watched the recognition arrive like a sunrise. "Denise?" Carol breathed. "Little Denise? My Denise? Now I have to take you back one more time. Just briefly. Because to understand why these 2 women stood frozen in a doorway with their hands over their mouths, you have to understand what they had been to each other. When Denise Carter was 12 years old, after a string of foster homes that had taught her to flinch and to hide food, and to never, ever let herself need anybody, she had been placed, almost by accident, in the home of a foster mother named Carol. And Carol had done a thing that nobody else in the whole system had managed to do. She had refused to let Denise be temporary. She had painted Denise's name on a little wooden plaque for her bedroom door. She had braided her hair on Sunday mornings. She had gone up to that school and raised pure thunder when a teacher wrote Denise off. She had sat at the foot of the bed on the bad nights and said, over and over, "You are not too much. You are not a burden. You are not going anywhere you don't want to go." For 4 years, the only 4 steady years of Denise's whole childhood, Carol had been the closest thing to a mother that Denise had ever known. And then Denise turned 18 and aged out, and life did what life does. It scattered them. Denise moved for work. Carol moved to care for an ailing aunt. Letters went to old addresses. Phone numbers changed. The thread that had held them, fragile and precious, simply slipped. Not from any lack of love, but from the plain, hard friction of 2 poor women trying to survive in a world that does not make it easy to hold on to the people you love. Denise had spent years telling herself she would find Miss Carol again someday. She never had. It was one of the great quiet griefs of her life, that the one person who had ever made her feel like she belonged somewhere had vanished back into the world, and Denise had never gotten to say thank you, had never gotten to say, "You saved me. Whatever I have made of my life, you are the reason I believed I could make anything at all." And now here she stood, on Miss Carol's blue-doored porch, holding her own son's hand, 20 years later. The 2 women fell into each other in that doorway and held on like they were each keeping the other one from drowning, and little Malik stood there patting them both on the arm, saying, "Mama? Mama? Are you okay? Are these happy tears or sad tears?" He did not get a clear answer, because the truth was, they were both. It was Carol who finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, laughing and crying at once, and said the words that turned Denise's blood to ice and fire at the same time. "But baby, how did you find me? After all this time, how on earth did you find your way to my door?" And Denise realized, in a rush, that Carol did not know. Carol had no idea why Denise had really come. Carol thought this was about them. Denise's mouth went dry. She looked at this woman named Carol, who lived in a house with a maple tree and a blue door, and the impossible, beautiful shape of the whole thing finally landed on her all at once. "Miss Carol," she said carefully, "can I ask you something? And I need you to bear with me, because it's going to sound strange." "Of course, baby. Was your father a carpenter, a man named Walter Boyd?" Carol went very still. The warmth drained out of her face, replaced by something old and guarded, the look of a person whose hand has just brushed a wound she has spent a lifetime keeping covered. "How?" Carol said slowly. "Do you know my father's name?" So Denise told her. Standing right there on the porch, with the cold coming up the path and the great maple creaking overhead, Denise told her everything. About the night bus and the man frozen in her headlights. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as... About a man who had lost nearly every memory he ever owned, but who could not, for the life of him, stop looking for a daughter named Carol, and a door he'd painted blue with his own 2 hands, so that she would always be able to find her way home. Carol's hand had risen to her mouth somewhere in the middle of it. By the end, she was holding on to the doorframe. "He's alive?" she whispered. "My father is. After all this time, he's alive, Miss Carol. He's at a care home about 9 miles from here. His mind is failing him. He doesn't always know what year it is. He doesn't always know his own self." Denise's voice broke. "But he knows you. Out of everything that man has lost, you are the one thing he held on to. He's been trying to walk to you, every single night, for weeks. He gets out and he tries to walk to you, Miss Carol, and the streets keep moving on him, and he can't find the way. And here, I have to tell you the truth of a complicated thing, because this story would be a lie if I made it simple. Carol did not melt into instant forgiveness. How could she? She turned away from the door. She walked into her living room, Denise and Malik following uncertainly, and she stood at the window with her back to them for a long, long time. And when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with 40 years of a pain she had carried alone. "He left me," Carol said. "Do you understand that? I was 6 years old. My mama had just died, and the one person I had left in this world packed a bag and handed me to my aunt, and walked out that blue door and never came back." She swallowed hard. "I waited for him. Lord, how I waited. I sat on that porch every evening for 2 years thinking, tonight, maybe tonight he comes back. And he never did. I grew up, I made my peace with it, or I told myself I did. And now you're telling me he was out there this whole time, and the reason he never came back is what? He was ashamed? He didn't have enough money?" She turned around, and her face was wet, and her voice cracked clean in half. "I didn't need his money. I needed my daddy." The room was silent. The big maple scratched at the window, and then a small voice spoke up. Malik, 9 years old, who had been listening to all of it with his whole serious heart. "But he kept the little house," Malik said. "The wooden one. Mama said he carved 2, one for him and one for you, so you'd both have a home, even when you were apart. He kept his for 40 years, in his coat, right over his heart." Malik frowned, working it out the way children do. "That doesn't seem like a man who forgot you. That seems like a man who couldn't forget you, even when he forgot everything else." Carol looked at the child, and something in her face came apart, slow and quiet, like ice going off a river in the spring. Because that was the thing, wasn't it? That was the thing that broke the last wall down. A man whose own mind had betrayed him, who had lost his words and his years and very nearly his own name, and the one memory his failing mind had fought to its knees to protect, the one thing it would not give up, was her, was Carol. Was the door he'd painted so his little girl could always find her way home. You can be angry at a man for 40 years, but it is very hard to stay angry at a man who, when stripped down to the last flickering ember of who he ever was, finds that the last thing left burning is you. "Take me to him," Carol whispered. "Please, take me to my daddy." They went the very next afternoon. Denise drove. Carol sat in the front seat with the little wooden house in her lap, because Carol had kept hers too. 40 years. Tucked in a drawer, moved from house to house, taken out and looked at on the hard nights and put away again. The two carvings sat side by side on Carol's knee on that drive, a matched pair separated for 4 decades, and they were as alike as two halves of one heart, down to the careful blue of their little doors. "Now, I want to prepare you for something, because I would not want you to walk into that room without warning, the way Carol did." Walter did not know her. That is the cruel arithmetic of the thing his illness had done to him. He could hold on to the idea of Carol, the name, the love, the door. But the actual woman who walked into the day room of Maple Court that afternoon, gray-haired and weeping, 66 years old, bore no resemblance to the 6-year-old on a swing that his memory had frozen in amber. He looked up at her politely from his chair by the window, this stranger crying in front of him, and his face filled with the gentle, anxious confusion that Denise had come to know so well. "Hello," Walter said. Do I know you, ma'am? I'm sorry. I'm not always, the streets keep moving on me." And Carol's face, which had been so full of 40 years of things she'd rehearsed saying, simply broke. For a moment, Denise thought the whole thing had been a mistake, a cruelty, to bring this woman all this way to a father who couldn't even remember. But then Carol did the wisest thing. She did not try to make him remember. She knelt down in front of his chair, slow, so as not to frighten him, the way Denise had taught her old riders liked to be approached. And she reached into her bag, and she took out her own little wooden house, and she set it gently on the arm of his chair, right next to its twin that Priya had quietly fetched from his coat. 2 little carved houses, side by side, 2 robin's egg blue doors. Walter stared at them. His whole body went still. His trembling hand came up, hovered over the 2 carvings, and then, very slowly, he picked them both up, one in each hand, and held them out in front of him, looking from one to the other and back again. And something moved across that ruined, beautiful old face. Not memory exactly. Memory was gone. It was something deeper than memory. It was recognition, rising up from a place below thought, from the bedrock of the man, from wherever it is in us that a father keeps his child when everything else has been taken away. 2, Walter said wonderingly. There were 2, one for me. His eyes lifted from the carvings to Carol's wet face, and they searched it, searched it, searched it. And one for my girl. "Daddy," Carol said. And Walter Boyd began, quietly, to weep. He did not know the year. He did not know the name of the city he sat in. He could not have told you what he had eaten for breakfast, or how he came to be in that chair. But he knew, in the only way that mattered, in the way that runs deeper than the mind, that the woman kneeling in front of him with a little blue door in her hand was the home he had spent 40 years trying to walk back to. "You found it," he said, reaching out to touch her gray hair with one shaking hand, as if to make sure she was real. "You found the blue door. I knew you would. I painted it bright so you'd always find your way home."
I found it, Daddy.
Carol wept, and she pressed her face into her father's hands. "I'm home. I'm home." Denise stood in the doorway of that day room, with her son's hand in hers and tears pouring down her face. And she did not try to stop them. "I would like to tell you that everything was perfect after that. But you and I are too old for fairy tales, and the truth is better than perfect anyway. The truth is real. Walter did not get his memory back. That is not how his illness worked, and I will not lie to you and say it was. There were days he knew Carol and days he did not. There were afternoons he called her by her dead mother's name, and afternoons he asked her, with perfect politeness, whether they had met before. The streets kept moving on Walter Boyd, right to the end. But here is the thing that no illness on this earth could take from them. Carol came. Every day, Carol came. She sat by that window with her father, and whether he knew her or not, she held his hand and told him about the maple tree, how big it had grown, and about the blue door she'd kept blue all these years without ever quite knowing why. And on the days he didn't know her, she would simply set the two little wooden houses on the arm of his chair, side by side, and watch the recognition rise up in him from below. Two. There were always two. And for those few minutes, every single time, Walter Boyd came home. A man can be given back his daughter even when he has lost his mind. Love, it turns out, does not live in the part of us that remembers. It lives somewhere deeper, somewhere the years can't reach. And Carol and Denise, well, the two of them were never letting go of each other again. Not this time. Carol could not believe, could not stop marveling, that of all the bus drivers in all the city, it had been her Denise, her foster girl, grown into this strong, tired, good-hearted woman, who had been the one to bring her father home. "Don't you see what you did?" Carol said to her one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch under the maple, while Malik chased fireflies in the yard. 20 years ago, I tried to give you a home, baby, a blue door of your own, and life pulled us apart before I was done. And now you've gone and given me mine back. You closed a circle I didn't even know was still open." She took Denise's hand. "That's not a coincidence. That's not luck. That's the Lord letting kindness finish what it started." And here, friends, is where this story reaches into your own life, so listen close. You remember the budget cuts. You remember the Route 9 nightline on the chopping block. Low ridership, not cost-effective. And Denise's job hanging by a thread alongside it. Well, it happened that Carol's late husband had left her this house and a small, careful nest egg, and a stubborn streak a mile wide. And it happened that Carol had spent her whole life taking in people the world had given up on. And it happened that when she heard that her Denise, who had just spent 3 weeks of her own exhausted life chasing down a stranger's blue door for no reward at all, was about to lose the only job standing between her and the street, Carol Boyd set that dish towel down on her shoulder and said, "Oh, we'll just see about that." I won't bore you with all of it, but Carol knew people. Church people, neighborhood people, the kind of quiet network of determined older women who, I promise you, run more of this world than anyone gives them credit for. Carol made some calls. And then Denise made the boldest move of her whole careful life. She stood up at a transit board meeting, in front of all those people, this woman who'd spent her life being invisible, and she told them about the nightline, about the dishwashers and the security guards and the nurses' aides with aching feet, about the lonely souls who rode the loop just to be somewhere warm, about an old man with a failing mind who'd been trying every night to walk home to his daughter, and how the only reason he ever made it was that there was a warm bus and a driver who didn't look away. "You call it low ridership," Denise told that board, her voice shaking and then growing steady. "I call it the people this city forgets after dark, and a city that won't keep one warm bus running for the people it forgot. What kind of a city is that, exactly?" They kept the nightline. I'd love to tell you it was Denise's speech alone. Truthfully, it was the speech, and the local reporter who picked up the story of the bus driver who reunited a lost old man with his daughter, and Carol's army of church ladies, and 100 small kindnesses pulling in the same direction at once. But that is how it always works, isn't it? That is the great secret of it. One small mercy, given freely in the cold and the dark, doesn't stay small. It rolls. It gathers. It picks up speed. Until one day you look up and a whole city has rearranged itself around a single woman who stopped her bus for a stranger. Walter Boyd lived another 14 months. They were good months. The best he'd had in 40 years, I'd wager, even if he couldn't always have told you why. He spent them surrounded. Carol came every day. Denise brought Malik on her days off, and the boy would sit and let the old carpenter show him, over and over, how to hold a piece of sandpaper and work it with the grain. With the grain, son. Always with the grain. You fight the wood, and the wood always wins. Walter's hands remembered the craft long after they'd forgotten everything else. Some afternoons, There'd be a whole little crowd of them in that day room. The foster mother, the foster daughter, the great-grandchild who wasn't really a great-grandchild by blood, but most certainly was by love. A family stitched together out of a bus route and a wooden carving, and one woman's refusal to drive on. And when Walter Boyd finally went, he went the gentlest way a man can go. He went in the afternoon, in his chair by the window, with the autumn light coming gold through the glass, and his daughter's hand in his. The two little wooden houses sat on the arm of his chair, side by side, the way they were always meant to be. His last clear words, Carol said, came soft and certain, and his eyes were on the carvings when he said them. "I found my way home," he said. "I always knew I would." They buried him beneath a maple tree. Carol planted it herself. "Now, there is one more thing I have to tell you, and then I'll let you go." A year after all of it, Denise and Malik moved out of those two rooms over the laundromat. Because Carol, who had a big house with one old woman rattling around in it, and a heart that had never once in its life been able to stand the sight of a person without a home, asked them to come and live with her. In the little house, on the east side. Under the great maple tree, the one with the blue door. And on the first morning in that house, Denise Carter stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands and watched her son run barefoot across a yard that belonged to people who loved him. And she understood, finally, the thing it had taken her whole hard life to learn. She had spent her childhood riding toward a door that kept moving. And it turned out the whole time, the door had been moving toward her. Slow, patient. Taking the long way round through a foster home and a lost old man and a freezing night on a city bus. But coming, always coming. She hung the little wooden house on a nail by that blue door. Carol's twin she hung right beside it. Two carved homes, two tiny blue doors, side by side at last in a doorway that had finally stopped moving. Malik asked her once why she kept them there, where everybody coming in could see them, and Denise thought about it for a while before she answered. "Because I spent my whole life thinking a home was a thing that could be taken away from you," she said. 11 different houses before I was grown, baby, and not one of them was mine to keep. So I want to look at these every single morning. I want to remember that the realest home isn't a building at all. It's the people who kept looking for you, the ones who never stopped." She touched the little blue doors, one and then the other. "Your great-grandpa Walter forgot almost everything there was to forget, but he never forgot to come home, and neither will I. Because that is the truth this old storyteller wanted to leave in your hands tonight. And you don't need a wooden carving or a maple tree for it to be true about you. The kindness you give to a stranger is never wasted, and it is never lost. You may not see where it goes. You may give it on the coldest night of your life, when you have nothing to spare and every reason in the world to look away. You may hand it to someone who can't even remember your name from one night to the next. And you will think, sometimes, that it simply vanished into the dark. But it doesn't vanish. It takes the long way round. It travels through grief and time and rain. And one day, when you least expect it, when you've forgotten you ever gave it, it comes walking back up the path toward you. It knocks on your door, and it hands you back the very thing you thought you'd lost forever." Denise stopped a bus for a stranger in the cold, and the stranger turned out to be the road home. So the next time life sets a lost soul in front of you, in the cold, in the dark, asking for nothing but somewhere warm to sit, I hope you'll remember Walter, and the blue door, and the woman who didn't drive on. I hope you'll look at the person, and not the inconvenience. Because you never, ever know what's waiting at the end of one small mercy. You never know whose girl is waiting. And you never know that the home you give away in the dark might just turn out to be your own. If this story found a place in your heart tonight, do an old storyteller one kindness in return. Go and be gentle, this very week, to one person the world has forgotten after dark. That's the only thank you I'll ever ask for. Until next time, take care of yourself, and keep a light on for the ones still trying to find their way home.